In November 1990, after more than 11 years in power, Margaret Thatcher left office. Far from being voted out in a general election, the Conservative Prime Minister was ousted out of Number 10 by members of her own parliamentary party in a manner redolent of intrigue and full of high drama. Only a year before, the Prime Minister had declared herself fit for 10 more years. Retirement from the top job was not on her agenda, but while the end was traumatic for Mrs. Thatcher, the warning signs had been visible for some time.
We're now in Smith Square. Mrs. Thatcher has arrived.
It's not uncommon for political careers to end in tears. In the case of a Prime Minister, from the moment of their first cabinet reshuffle, they create potential enemies keen to see their leader cast out. For Prime Minister Thatcher, the incident that would foretell her later downfall came in the middle of her premiership. It would expose splits within government and feature the resignation of not one, but 2 cabinet ministers.
Mrs. Thatcher has been under a lot of pressure from dismayed Tories to end the damaging row over Westland. She came to the Cabinet this morning determined to put a stop to Mr. Heseltine's vigorous and highly public campaigning.
By December 1985, the row inside government over who should buy out Westland helicopters had spiralled out of control. Defence Secretary Michael Heseltine favoured a European consortium, whereas Trade and Industry Secretary Leon Brittan preferred an American option, also supported by Mrs. Thatcher. Furious that in his view he was not being listened to, Michael Heseltine resigned.
I have today tendered my resignation from the government, not because of the discussion at today's Cabinet, but because of the way that the reconstruction of Westland plc has been handled over a period of months.
Then, following his departure, he engaged in a war of words accusing Mrs. Thatcher of being complicit in efforts to undermine him and forcing Leon Brittan out of office.
I think any minister has got to have the full confidence of his colleagues. I didn't have any doubt about that until this morning. This morning I made inquiries, I discussed the matter with friends and colleagues, and I came to the conclusion that I didn't have the full confidence without which you can't really do the job.
With 2 cabinet resignations in as many weeks, Mrs. Thatcher's authority was now in question.
The tactics of it all became very confused, but what did not become confused was the Prime Minister's loss of authority over what was happening. Whatever the truth about this letter or that, or this publication or that, what was quite clear is that, amazingly, the Iron Lady had lost control.
She knew that if things had turned very badly against her, and if she was not able to carry her own party and her own backbenchers with her, then there was a real risk, just that she was not going to be Prime Minister anymore. So that was the first really serious wobble.
But if her fellow ministers thought Mrs. Thatcher would learn from the experience, they were wrong.
Towards the end, she became more presidential. She began to believe her own propaganda, began to fly by the seat of her pants, and her intuition was no longer as sound as it had been when she started, and it did become irritating towards the end.
Heseltine's resignation was clearly a dangerous moment for Mrs. Thatcher, but one she survived. Indeed, in the following year she was re-elected for a 3rd term. The campaign, though, was not the happiest.
In Central Office itself, in Smith Square, there were these extremely serious disagreements, particularly after one quite early bad poll. What happened was she brought in a sort of rival campaign operation. So you had Lord Tebbett's campaign, but you had another select group that she picked to run almost a rival campaign, and there was terrible friction.
She should have saved our money. We could all have gone on 3 weeks holiday and we'd have had a perfectly... The public could see that Thatcherism was working.
It is wonderful to be entrusted with the government of this country, this great country, once again. And I want to say this to you. The greater the trust, the greater the duty upon us to be worthy of that trust. And we will indeed endeavour to serve the people of these islands in the future as we have in the past.
8 years into her premiership, and Mrs. Thatcher looked invincible. It was also said she was becoming increasingly intolerant of those who disagreed with her and less willing to listen, particularly to the pro-European lobby within the Tory party.
It became an increasing problem in the cabinet. I mean, I was in the cabinet by the late 1980s, and I was in the cabinet when we were doing the Single European Act. But as time went on, we could pick up the fact that she was getting more scratchy about Europe, and various European issues began to come up. And I didn't realise, because the three of them were so discreet about it, that she, Geoffrey and Nigel were falling out so badly over monetary policy, really, the ERM, and whether or not we were going to join the ERM, and whether or not we were engaging in what became the construction of the single currency. Margaret had a kind of blind spot on that.
In Brussels, the talk was all of economic and monetary union. There was even discussion of a European social charter. Mrs. Thatcher was less than impressed, and in a speech to the College of Europe in Bruges in September 1988, she set out her views of what the European community should be and what it should not.
Europe will be stronger precisely because it has France as France, Spain as Spain, Britain as Britain, each with its own customs, traditions and identity. It would be folly to try to fit them into some sort of identikit European personality. We have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level, with the European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels.
The speech did not go down well with other European leaders, and the pro-Europeans in the party started to despair.
The Bruges speech was certainly not fair to describe it as an anti-European speech. It was a revisionist European speech. It was trying to move away from trends in European development which she didn't like. But she had not carried her senior ministers with her, and her relations with them were poor, and so were her relations with Jacques Delors and various other people, Helmut Kohl. And so she was sort of in an antagonistic position.
Mrs. Thatcher, though, knew the mood among Tory party supporters, as was evidenced by the ecstatic welcome she received at the party conference the following month.
One interesting thing about Mrs. Thatcher's position on Europe was that it was always quite popular, except, and it's turned out to be fatal, with her senior colleagues.
The divisions within the cabinet were growing stronger. By 1989, the relationship between Geoffrey Howe and Mrs. Thatcher had broken down. Their political marriage was heading towards a messy divorce. In July 1989, Mrs. Thatcher reshuffled her cabinet and dropped Geoffrey Howe as Foreign Secretary. He was made leader of the House and given the title Deputy Prime Minister.
It remains to be seen how much long-term damage has been done to the government. Mrs. Thatcher may have created enemies who are very close to her. It may be that in the run-up to the election she'll have reason to regret that.
Geoffrey Howe began to irritate the Prime Minister by the slow, measured way in which he liked to argue a case, and by his unwillingness to sort of leap quickly to fresh conclusions. And she didn't realise, I think she genuinely didn't realise how badly she was reacting to this, how it showed, and how much offence he was taking. He was very badly treated in Cabinet and outside.
3 months later, and a disgruntled Chancellor was about to resign. Nigel Lawson walked out in protest at being upstaged, second-guessed, and, as he perceived it, attacked by Mrs. Thatcher's economics adviser Alan Walters. The issue was Europe, the exchange rate mechanism, and economic and monetary union.
This is the man who Mr. Lawson felt he couldn't work alongside. Sir Alan Walters, seen here at his home in Washington, was refusing to comment to ITN.
You appreciate there's a substantial row going on in the British papers about this, do you, sir?
Yeah, I say nothing.
Have you changed your mind at all?
The biggest row of all, really, was about whether or not we joined the ERM, which Nigel Lawson had been converted to the idea that we should, and had been defeated, first of all, in a meeting in November 1985, but